Today, we welcome Dr. Anand from the article Simulating Virtual Organizations for Research, a comparative empirical evaluation of text-based video and virtual reality video vignettes, published in the July 2025 issues of ORM Journal. Anand, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for our interview today, we'll talk about the background story of the paper as well as the author's experience with the review process, their motivations, and their thoughts of how to take this research forward. So to start us off, Anand, can you give us like a brief highlight of this article and how can it help scholars in their research?
So very briefly, this article highlights why and how virtual reality can benefit organizational research. Um, So we did several studies looking at different kinds of ways to conduct vignette studies, which have been for decades now been a staple for organizational scholars to conduct experiments online, particularly using these scenarios, descriptions of an organizational setting, perhaps an charismatic leader that you have to envision
Mhm.
having a conversation with, being supervised by maybe an organizational setting of an HR practice like we have done. And well, again, traditionally, those are text-based, and we compared that with the effectiveness of turning that text into a script that could be played as a video, and also more importantly, what happens when we import that video onto a virtual reality headset and put participants really in the organizational space, in the entire environment, basically surrounding them. In our case, a boardroom. And then we empirically show how that leads to greater effect sizes on the one hand, potentially less distractions, and generally also just a more ecologically valid way to measure organizational behavior.
Yes, and thank you for sharing with us kind of like the brief highlight of the article. And I'm excited to dive more into the background story of this article. So, what motivated you to study VR and use it in organizational research and start this paper?
So I have to give credit to several people here to enable me to do this and to inspire me to do so. Um, so really starting at the beginning, in 2016, I started my PhD on talent management at the KU Leuven in Belgium with Professor Nicky Dries as my supervisor. She's also on the paper as a co-author. And it was my task to do talent management research, obviously. And we were going to do experiments. We're going to manipulate with how inclusive talent pools are. I'm not going into those details, but I was kind of instructed or prompted to do vignette research, a method I wasn't very familiar with previously. So I started digging into that. Okay, what do vignette research look like? How do you go about it in an appropriate manner? How do you collect rich data, etc.? I even took a course on it at some point. But very quickly I realized, like, hey, there are some people, specifically Herman Aguinas and peers who also in 1997 already advocated for using virtual reality as a tool to do vignette research. And there's actually two papers. One of them is in ORM, I think from 2014, if I'm not mistaken, where they advocate for virtual reality. So I was so surprised then when I started digging deeper that they had been advocating for it already for 20 years at the time, but there wasn't a single study out there that, in our field at least, that made use of virtual reality. So, um, you could maybe think and be daunted, like, okay, well, there's no prior precedent to do this kind of research. I'm going to try something else. Or you're like me and you feel like, okay, well, people are asking for this. Let's just give it a try. What have we got to lose?
Hmm.
So I went to my supervisor, so lots of credits to her for then also encouraging me to pursue it, because she was like, well, if you want to use virtual reality, by all means go ahead. Ideally get some funding. It's a little bit more
Hmm.
expensive to conduct that kind of research. So I did indeed apply for funding, which I got, and then allowed me to get some experts to set up the first virtual reality study. Um, and by those means, then I ultimately managed to conduct that virtual reality study. Now, these days, there are many more virtual reality scholars, but at the time I was dependent on experts from different fields. So within
Mhm.
ecology, VR has been used a bit more extensively. Um, and I had help from Diana Sanchez to conduct these VR studies. She's also a co-author on the paper. Um, but what happened was the pandemic. So
Mm.
my VR study was set to launch on April 2020.
Oh no.
And one of the downsides of VR research, it has a lot of positives. One downside, you do need your participants physically in the room with you. It's not
Yes.
really possible to conduct this with online panels, potentially in the future, but that's not super realistic yet. So, um, yeah, I couldn't conduct my study for the time being, but I also had a PhD to finish. So after a long conversation, we basically settled on the idea like, okay, well, as long as there's a quarantine, um, do the same study, but just do it online. So not VR, but do it with a video, which I did, and which got ended up being included in my dissertation. But I put a lot of time and effort into creating this
Yes.
VR application as well. So when the quarantine was gone, I was like, I'm going to collect my data now. The organizations are still keen to participate. I'm just going to collect that data. We'll see what happens with it. So I did that. And then at some point I also realized like, okay, I have basically the exact same study done with video in virtual reality. Let's just do it text-based and compare it, right?
Mm.
And here we are. It led to the publication now that recently appeared in ORM.
Yes, I think it's really interesting how your experience evolved and how it leads to this paper. And can you share more about what issues or like your experience during the review process and how have the paper developed to this current version right now?
So the review process was fairly interesting, I could say. I must also say it was the friendliest, most constructive, mildest reviews that I've gotten. I felt like the reviewers were very helpful in shaping up the um, article, especially in terms of making it more accessible for other scholars to start doing VR. I think it was their input that led to the decision tree that's included in the publication. Um, as well as like several tables, a lot of practical input. But what made it quite special was that in the first round of reviews, there was one reviewer, and despite being very constructive and having lots of helpful things, did have one fundamental comment, which was, "This is not VR." Which, when you submit a paper on like comparing different methods with VR, that was quite a shock to us. So we sat down, we looked at the comment. I mean, there was some explanation on why he or she claimed that it wasn't VR. Um, his or her arguments, including that if you cannot like interact in the world entirely with you and like move around, interact with objects or talk with avatars or something, it's not VR, which is to their credit, there's some truth to it. There's like different variations of VR. You have like 6 degrees of freedom VR, where indeed you have
Mm.
more freedom, and then you have like more static VR, which is like, uh, yeah, more like a roller coaster VR. We call that just a static experience where you go through, which is immersive, but isn't per se interactive. But vignettes, in and of themselves, aren't interactive. We've never heard of
Mm.
interactive vignettes before. If they become interactive, is it then still a vignette? It's not really. It's a different kind of study. So we didn't fully agree with that because there are plenty of VR applications, teachings, and stuff around there which are in and of themselves static as well, like YouTube VR or several business schools use VR for teaching, which also doesn't include any interactions. It's just like you going through simulation and then learning from that. So it's always difficult to go against a reviewer, right? It's very tempting to
Mhm.
be like, oh, you're right. We're very happy we got this R&R, so let's just please you. But we went against their directive hard, and
Mhm.
we developed a response that I think is still one of my most impressive responses at this point. So just to that one single comment, we wrote a response of, if I'm not mistaken, I should look it up, but I think it was 8 pages long just for one single comment with surmounting amounts of evidence to say like, hey, they are calling it VR in this publication. This is VR. There it's VR. This is VR. Like, I get your point, and we can nuance it a little bit, but it is at the end of the day VR. And the
Mm.
reviewer did wholeheartedly agree and was happy that at least we nuanced it a little bit. Um, yeah, so that was quite interesting. I think one of the few times that I really went that hard against against the comment. But in the end of the day, it worked out well. And I think you have solid arguments, then that's definitely not a reason not to do so.
Yes, and I think with it looks like it's a also a collaborative and constructive process as well, where maybe you provide more context and the literature of VR to the reviewer team and how the paper developed to this current state and this published state. So with that, and with your experience working in VR and using VR in organizational research, what is your current evaluation of the current state of using VR in organizational research right now?
Still too limited. That's my initial response. We are to some extent still a niche community, but we're seeing more and more interest building up on it, which is, I think, is just a great start. Of course, I wholeheartedly believe in the value of VR research, and again, we also demonstrate its advantages and value above more traditional research methods. I think people are still just a bit scared. Maybe some are
Hmm.
skeptical, but it sounds, and I know I just a few minutes ago I made it sound like it's very time consuming, very expensive, but it really isn't or doesn't need to be. It can be absolutely, and I think there's still this idea that you need to have lots of funding and lots of time to do these studies. But it's fortunate that we published this paper because now people are starting to reach out like, hey, I have a research question. I think VR would add value to it. Can you help me think through the design? And I just at like last AOM, I think I met with 3 different people who were wanted to pitch their VR research idea to me. And I've already collaborated on several as well to help with the design thereof. So I think it's coming. Give it
Hmm.
1 or 2 more years before these things are published, but I think we will see more VR research coming. We also build a community of virtual reality scholars, both in the field of management and a little bit more broadly with psychology and education included as well, um, to basically try and support each other to do this kind of research, to potentially act as reviewers for each other's papers, and to yeah, make spread the word that it isn't that daunting as it is. So as part of that, I'm happy to be included for this. I am also happy to do workshops at times to demonstrate how fun, cool, and useful VR can be. Um, so concretely, if I may add, and as we also write in that paper, it is a little bit more time consuming. Obviously, if you have funding to
Hmm.
do a prolific study, you can have your data within 24 hours, right? Okay, VR absolutely doesn't compare to that, but these headsets only cost $300-400 euros. So that's I would consider a relatively minor investment, especially compared to if you were using online panels. Um, and you essentially, for these virtual reality video vignettes, you essentially just need a camera, a 360 camera, mind you, but also they are for 200 euros, you have a high quality one. So with that equipment, armed with that equipment, you can already start just making these scenes. And we always recommend to use people from your own personal network to fill in the roles of the actors that are playing certain roles. Like if you have we had an HR director, we had some co-workers, we had some people that played the role of more like a uh, happy, bubbly co-workers. Other ones were a little bit more upset, and um, these basic roles can be fulfilled by anyone, but we recommend to take people that have experience with such a role. If you fill in the role of HR director, take an actual HR person to do that role. We know of people who've done virtual reality vignettes with like professional acting crews and spend maybe like tens of
Hmm.
thousands on them. and the results are disastrous. And it's terrible quality because these people are overacting, and
Hmm.
it feels very awkward to see people then in that situation. So get people who are comfortable filling in these roles in real life, which I think for us as organizational scholars studying organizational topics should in most cases be relatively simple, and then also doesn't cost you a lot of money.
Hmm.
Um, so
Yes, thank you. And also following up on that, with scholars who want to study using VR but are hesitant by using it with the time consuming or the challenge, what other advice that you would give for scholars who want to start using VR in their research?
um, scholars that are facing challenges with time, like perhaps PhD students that need to finish on time and stuff. Well, um, the general advice is to what I've done with my own studies in the past, and recommend people, if it's at least possible, is to get some research assistance, potentially like master or bachelor thesis students that write their thesis with you as a supervisor. Maybe you can get them on board with the project and they can help with data collection. It's again, it can be a little time consuming to see all these different participants one-on-one, and give them a headset, then give them an opportunity to fill in a survey and such. Um, but if you have potentially like four different kinds of headsets, you have a research assistant, you can process people in groups potentially, put them in separate rooms. What we also did in the past is go past organizations and just have like one of the managers there create an entire schedule of employees that just visit you in a specific room on a like a half hourly basis, and just process people in like sequentially in several small groups. For us, it's proven to be really successful, and we have managed to get about like up to 40 participants a day just with like two of us working together. Again, it's slower than prolific, but you have real participants and you get very solid data. Can be
Yeah.
circulated well. Um, yeah.
Well, I think that's very interesting of like you can be on site in
Mm.
the organizations and collect data from working adults in those organizations.
If I might add, organizations are also much more keen to work together with you if you say like, "Hey, we have a virtual reality study, and we're going to put people through the simulation. Well, you'll get
Mhm.
some access to these insights. You can try it out yourself. Happy to do a workshop, etc." Blah blah blah. They're like, "Oh, this sounds lovely." Yeah. They're kind of surprised that scientific research can actually be so captivating.
Fun.
Something
Yes.
that I've gotten as feedback. So um, yeah, I just recommend people to just also just start with it. Again, it can be very daunting, and you will hear of VR studies that might have cost hundreds of thousands of euros. I mean, I've also been there and done that, but those are like super highly complicated,
Mhm.
custom designed uh, simulations where there is like interactions and stuff like that. But I just always tell people just start simple. Start with like this virtual reality video vignette. You'll see how actually easy it is. You get some experience handling the tools, which is also helpful if you've never used a virtual reality headset. You can think like, oh, this is going to be so super difficult. Well, just so start simple, and then if you've gotten the spark, like I did, and many others in our community as well, um, then yeah, you might be prompted and triggered to explore more.
Yes. And do you have advice for scholars who are facing like te maybe technological hurdles of designing VR studies? What would be your advice for them?
Hmm. I mean, we're touching on several design aspects in our paper, of course, but I with every virtual reality video vignette that I design, there's always some learning point. There's always something like, oh,
Mhm.
this caught me a bit unaware. Again, this is still a little bit more new territory that we're exploring here, right? So, um, it, there can be. very minor things compared to like how the camera is positioned that impacts the entire experience. The main advice is to really do a bit of like a pilot for yourself, not per se like a
Mm,
participant pilot, but just like put the camera somewhere, have people
mhm,
just have some conversations and just try it out on the virtual reality headset. Don't just look at the video on your computer or on the camera itself. Like really just exported it and just
mhm,
check that when you put on the headset that the experience feels authentic, that it and that the sound is
mhm.
correct. Like in one case, it looked perfectly fine on the camera. I was like, oh, this is great. But then we put on the headset and we actually realized like, oh, we're like yay high and everybody else is this high. And so
Mhm.
it felt a bit intimidating. I was like, oh, this is not what we were manipulating. So just something like the camera height can be important, but also the
Mhm.
microwave, the microphone of the camera can be a bit sensitive. So we had once somebody wearing like high heels, and every time that
Mm.
person walked, it vibrated through to the microphone,
Ah,
which I mean it's minor, but that caused a little bit of a annoyance, so to say, which is again not the experience you want for participants. So um, yeah, really put it on a virtual reality headset, try it out, and then if everything technically is working, then really start acting it out in full. Um, yeah.
yeah, and I think it's very interesting stories, things that I would not, expected that about the high heels that can influence participant experience. So, very interesting and helpful snippets and stories that you share here. And with the rising of using VR in organizational research, what do you think some future research directions for scholar to take when they want to apply this method into their studies?
Um, I think the sky is the limit here. It's hard to think of something here on the spot. Um, Obviously, anything interpersonal comes first, whether it's like in the context of leadership or in workplace conflicts. Um, if you read about people in a text vignette, which I've done so many studies, well,
Mm,
not myself, but I've participated in other people's studies where you just have all these details about, okay, imagine working with Sarah, and Sarah is a volunteer at the animal shelter. She's always friendly and cooperative with others. Like how, and then more generally, like, how do you feel about working with her? I'm like, huh? It's very hard to get a impression of somebody just based on words, and so anything for which this how somebody feels, like the vibe, the emotions, and just even like things like tone of voice, where the interpersonal variance is super important to get an impression. And if you do studies that are like interpersonally based like this, I feel like virtual reality is like the go-to method, right? Unless you're
mhm,
doing field experiments. I mean, we're not competing with that, but
mhm.
uh, we're just talking about like regular experiments. Um, so I would expect a lot there is on the one hand. On the other hand, virtual reality allows you to create any kind of setting you want, right? So if you are doing research on the future of work and you want to think about futuristic scenarios, even though they're related to work settings that aren't realistic at this point, but you want to get some data on how people feel about working in that. Again, if putting that on paper can make it very hard to really imagine that. People will then relate it because it to their own context. Because what happens with these text vignettes is that there's always like missing bits of information, and you use your own experiences to fill in that information. You
Mhm.
you read about a person or you read about a setting, you think about your own work setting. You might imagine a colleague, and you use those people, those contexts, then to fill in your experience. And of course, as a researcher, that's not something you can control for. Not
Mhm.
great. Um, the VR does that for you essentially. So these futuristic scenarios are also definitely then worth thinking about. Um, yeah, those are the two top of my mind right now.
Yes, and I think we can see the very big potential of using VR in organizational research, making the experience more authentic, and also kind of like control for some of the participants' experience or like their feeling in of the imagination for those vignettes. So very high potential to use and applicable in organizational research.
Absolutely. And if I
And
may, I think moving
yes.
forward, we're also going to see these simulations become more dynamic, become even more interactive with the advent of AI. Like at the time when this study was conducted, was before ChatGPT took the world by storm. And now for my latest research, I'm actively integrating also AI into these virtual reality simulations to we can now also think about not just having human actors play out a role, even though I would still recommend starting there because it's easy. It's a
Mhm.
nice entry level VR study. But the next step then will also to be thinking about potentially using AI powered organizational actors to fill in different kinds of roles. You just need a couple of prompts to be like, hey, this is a charisma. You play the role of a charismatic leader. You're a toxic coworker. You
Mhm.
know, you name it. You can give them names. You can give them entire directives on how to respond, and then you can actually put people in these VR simulations and have conversations with AI avatars to play out various roles. You lose some of the control. Obviously, Gen AI is in its essentially unpredictable, right? But at the same time,
Mhm.
you can record all these interactions and you can control for how these play out. Everything is all the data is being collected, so you can even like analyze these verbal interactions based on how people respond to different kinds of organizational actors. So I think that's now our logical next step, and yeah, well, maybe we'll see another publication in ORM appearing in the future related to this. Who knows?
Yes, I'm excited to see, what you and also scholars who are using VR, more applications of this method in organizational research. And before we conclude, do you have any other thoughts that you want to share with the audience that we have not discussed today?
Well, as I mentioned, we have this international community of scholars, of virtuality scholars, doing research both within management, psychology, education, and more broadly. Um, so I would invite everyone listening who's interested in this to visit the Openverse, so like metaverse, but then instead Openverse.
Mhm.
Uh, we're currently with around 70 scholars, if I'm not mistaken, and we essentially share all the creations that we make. We believe in working together to co-create these immersive simulations. We believe in the power they have in conducting cool and rigorous research. So we want to help people to get started with these topics, whether you're a leadership scholar, an emotion scholar, human resources, conflicts, etc. There's will most likely be somebody amongst our community who could also help you specifically with your research and think about how to start conducting a VR research. We're there to help. So yeah, check us out, join the community, and happy to help.
Yes, and I will also include the information of Openverse in our notes in the YouTube video as well. So hopefully
Okay. That
it's more
would
accessible for the audience.
that would be fantastic.
Yes. Thank you very much again, Anand, for your time today and also for your exciting work in VR and for your team, and hopefully looking forward to your future work as well.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me again, and all the
Yes.
best to you.
Yes. Thank you.